Do you have a clear idea of how much you're going to have as income this year, what your income for 2014 will be? Can you put that number in your head, whatever it is? Now, the exercise is then multiply that number by 15. If you're mathematically challenged like I am, you can do 20 instead. It's simpler. So you get this number in your head, whatever your income in 2014 would be, and then you multiply it by 15 or 20. Do you get a big number or a little number? No number? Big? How many get big numbers? Big number? Yeah. Or does it feel like it's little? Big number maybe. You know, if you get that, hold that number in your mind. That's what a talent is. A talent, if I listen to the Lutheran commentator, is 15 times what one would earn in a year. Lutherans are more humble, I guess, than Methodists, or less optimistic, because the Methodist commentator said it was 20 times. So whatever that is, you get this notion that in our gospel we have a story about a man who is handing out talents, and a talent is a big number. And as he is preparing for a trip, and if you can imagine, could you imagine somebody, whatever that number times 20 is, if somebody rang your doorbell or called you and your boss calls you into the office, the dean of students or somebody, or somebody, when I was a kid, we had the TV show, The Millionaire, that somebody would ring your doorbell and hand you a check for $1 million. $1 million used to be a lot of money in that day. But could you imagine somebody taking this number, 15 or 20 times what your annual income would be, and handing you the check and say, I'm going away for a while. Here, take care of this for me, will you? Can you imagine that? Now, could you imagine that maybe it would be twice that, 40 years? Or maybe 5 times that, 100 years? It's a lot of money, don't you think? So if it was your money, what kind of expectation would you have if you were giving that money and putting it it may be that you've got a savings account, maybe you might be doing CDs, or maybe you would go to some mutual fund or some kind of fund manager, somebody who would take care of your money. Maybe you'd want to do it yourself. As for me, I think that's pretty scary. But you may identify somebody, or they may be coming to you, and what do you do with it? Well, as this story is told, we find that these 3 people, one received 100 years' worth of income, another received 40 years' worth of income, and one just received 20 years' worth. Big numbers. And they received that because they were perceived as having a capacity, a capability, in Greek, the dunamis, the actual power, the power to do things with that. And so they were entrusted with the wisdom of this man who wanted to have a varied portfolio and not just put it all into one person's hands, I guess. Isn't that the common sense of the day? And it's all there. And one goes out and it says he trades with it. And the man with the 5 talents with the 100-year doubles the amount of money. Now it's really big. And the man with 2 talents, he does something and he doubles it as well, and now that's really big. But the other man who received just the $1 million, or whatever it is, the big number that's only 1 talent, doesn't think he has the power to do what needs to be done, or at least what he thinks the master would want to have done with it, because he knows that the master is a harsh man. He's somebody who harvests where he hasn't sown. He reaps. He goes out, and if it's doing, in fact, that's maybe how he got to be a slave, that maybe he had money. Maybe he had land and had to borrow it. And in the ancient world, if you couldn't pay your debts, then you were your own collateral. You became a slave. And maybe he was afraid of the man because he knew that if he borrowed seed money from him and the crops failed, that he would be taken. Maybe he didn't agree with the approach that this harsh man took to doing business. and just couldn't stomach the idea that he in turn would be taking that money, that seed, that property that the man left with him, and extracting from the people around him what he would need to multiply it, to double it. Maybe he just flat out disagreed with what was expected of him, or at least what he thought was expected of him. And so he just took the money and he buried it. He put it in a hole. They say in the ancient world that wasn't uncommon, to take something that's really valuable and bury it. Growing up in Pennsylvania Dutch country, there were lots of stories, the Depression era, of people who had secret compartments in their walls. There would be houses that would be demolished, and dollar bills would flutter in the air from things that had been put under the floorboards or behind the walls. People thinking that banks weren't safe, that you couldn't rely on them because they crash. And maybe that was just a normal thing to do, a normal expectation. But anyway, the master returned, and he came and he wanted an accounting, and the first guy comes and says, here it is, I've doubled your 10 talents, I've doubled your 5, here are 10 talents back to you, and oh, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. Great approval. And you've done so much with what I've given you, I will give you yet more to be in charge of. The second man comes. Here I have, instead of 2 talents, 4 talents for you. Oh, good and faithful servant, you've done wonderfully. Enter into the joy of your master. And then the third man comes. Says, Lord, you know, I know you're a harsh and tough man. You reap where you haven't sown. You go into you harvest things that you haven't cut, or it's not your work. You just take those things up. And I was afraid. Greek word is phobia. I had a phobia about this. And so I simply took it and I buried it. Here it is. Everything you gave me, I returned to you. Everything. Is that enough? Is that enough if that's your check that you've invested, that you've left, your retirement fund, your savings account, your college tuition, say, whatever it is that you're saving for? Is that enough? How do you react to that? In many ways, this is actually the end of the parable. This is the end of the story that Jesus is telling to people. What do you think? What do you think the reaction of the master should be to that? And in the Jewish literature of the day, it was frequently the practice to just insert the comments, the reactions of people, if you will, the thought-out reactions. And it may be that the people very much sided with this reaction of the master, who is outraged. You wicked servant, he says. You are wicked. You wasted my time, my effort. At least you could have put it in some kind of interest-bearing savings account if you can find one. You could have put it into the hands of somebody who is trading. You could have even given it to one of these other guys. They would have done better with it than you did, but you just buried it. And you say that you know that I reap and I sow where I don't sow. You say you understand that. How could you do this? What do you think? Is that your reaction? When you open up your statement savings account or your investment account and you look and see, oh, I got to get rid of this guy. I have to go somewhere else. You ought to have invested my money with the bankers, he said. Didn't work what you did. So he looks at somebody and says, you take the talent, you take it, and you manage it for me. Give it to the guy who got the 10 talents on my behalf. For those who have, more will be given, he said. And from those who have nothing, it'll be taken. Is that true? You believe that? Is that what we aspire to? As for this worthless slave, as for this wicked, worthless slave, cast him out. Cast him out. Throw him into the outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. If I read the newspaper correctly, that's pretty much what we do these days, isn't it? When somebody falls short of our expectations, be it an athlete, a superstar of some kind, Somebody crashes and burns before. Get rid of them. They let us down. Hedge fund investors, people who manage money, when they let us down, what do we say? Let's get somebody else. Do it differently. They were asleep at the switch. They ought to be thrown out. Paul talks about being asleep or awake. His advice is that let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober, be attentive, be awake, be alert. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who are drunk, drink at night. But we belong to the day, he says. We belong to the time when the light is shining and where we can see clearly. Let us see clearly. Let us be sober and put on the breastplate, the thorax in Greek. I love it. Is the thorax right here? Put it on. Put the thorax on of faith and love. And a helmet of hope. Hope for salvation. Hope for salvation that comes because God has destined us not for wrath in this text. Actually, the Greek word is orgion or orgy. God doesn't want us to be into the orgies of life, into the feeds, the big feeds. They say that people respect strength and viciously attack weakness. We don't want to be in that feeding cycle of going after the small fish so that we can feel bigger. We don't want to do that. That's not what God intends for us or calls us to do, but God has designated us to obtain salvation, to live lives that are whole and healed and well and balanced. Lives that come to us because somebody else has already died for us. Jesus Christ died for us so that, he says, and here's the gospel little note for you, so that whether you are awake at the switch or asleep at the switch, you may live, we may live with him. That's gospel. Now, I don't know how good your investment practices are. I have confidence in the people that I have entrusted my meager savings to. I think they're awake at the switch. Sometimes I wonder. Sometimes people leave things for me to do. And on the whole, I hope they think I'm awake and not sleeping on the job. But because we all know there are times when you're awake or you're asleep, and we're relying on somebody else to carry us, Paul says we ought to encourage one another to not tear each other down, not belittle each other or toss each other out into the outer circle of darkness where the teeth are gnashing. Encourage one another and build each other up as you're already doing. The gospel comes to us saying, whether you are awake or asleep, and this is a big turn from the one who wants to throw people out into the outer darkness because they're asleep on the job. Whether you are awake or asleep, he says, you live with him, with Christ the Lord. And because Christ lives with you, don't shred each other. Don't tear each other down. Build each other up. Encourage each other, because this is the way of the Lord. Thanks be to God.